Close your eyes for a second, or if you're driving, if you're moving through the noise of your city, just bring your attention to the very center of your chest, right there, behind the breath. Do you feel that? That subtle, constant, almost rhythmic contraction. It isn't a heart attack. It isn't a clinical disease you'll find in a textbook. It is something far more silent, and because it is silent, it is far more dangerous. Alan Watts, our guide for this leg of the journey, called it the tightening of the heart against reality. It is a physical no, a cellular refusal to let the world be exactly as it is. You carry it when you wake up. You carry it into your meetings. You even carry it into your sleep. It is a silent scream that your body has been practicing for so long that you've mistaken it for your own name. Most of you have spent your entire lives believing a fundamental lie. You believe you feel this way because life is heavy. You think the weight in your chest is a reaction to the bills that aren't adding up, the relationship that went cold, or the chaotic, burning world outside your window. You see yourself as a victim of circumstances, a leaf blown by the wind of external events. But tonight, the quantum carriage stops at a different station. Tonight, we reverse the polarity. I am not here to teach you how to change the world so you can finally feel better. I am here to show you that the world you see, the very reality you struggle against, is merely the shadow cast by your own refusal of reality. Listen closely. You do not get angry because someone cut you off in the San Francisco fog or the New York traffic. You don't. You use that insult, that minor inconvenience, to satisfy a hunger for anger that already inhabits your body like a tenant who hasn't paid rent in a decade. The anger had a seat reserved in your nervous system. The insult just happened to show up on time to fill it. Your emotional state is not a reaction. It is an invisible gravity. It is what we call your emotional baseline, the resting temperature of your biology. Like a thermostat locked at 60 degrees in the middle of a winter storm, your system will do anything to return to its setting. If your baseline is set to struggle, you will find a way to make $1 million feel like a burden. If your baseline is set to anxiety, you will find a way to turn a sunset into a threat. And here is the secret no one tells you in the self-help books. You are addicted to that weight. Your body has made a secret agreement with pain. It has learned to prefer the familiar sting of the old baseline over the terrifying vastness of peace. Because to your nervous system, the old you, the one who suffers, the one who fights, is safe. It is predictable. It provides what Carl Jung called psychological stability, even if that stability is a cage. If you can feel that tightness right now, if you realize that this internal gravity has been the real architect of your failures, then hit the like button. This isn't for me, and it isn't for the algorithm. It is your first physical act of surrendering the fight. It is your signal to the system that you have stopped fighting the current. Subscribe now, because we are crossing the bridge into Phase 5, Identity. We are moving past the machine and into the ghost. We are moving beyond the chemical addiction to the you that hasn't worked, and toward the you that has been waiting behind the tightening. In this episode, Alan Watts will lead us through this emotional ocean. He is here to remind you that your habitual frequency is your habitual level of life. If you want to change the scenery of your existence, you must first, quite literally, let go of the tightening. You must stop being the storm and start being the witness. You know the feeling. Someone says the wrong thing. A plan falls apart. An email comes in at the worst possible time. And before you have even formed a single thought, there it is. A tightening in the chest, the breath gets shallow. The field of awareness narrows. The world that felt open a second ago suddenly feels smaller. Alan Watts had a name for it. The tightening of the heart against reality. It is not a response to what happened. It is the refusal of what is. Not a deliberate refusal, not a decision you make, something that fires below language. The nervous system sees the event, runs its pattern match in milliseconds, and returns a verdict. This should not be happening. And that verdict, this should not be happening, is the tightening itself. Now notice something. There are two ways to move from here. The first is reaction. The hook shines in the water. You bite. You are pulled down before you even saw the line. Most of the time, for most people, this is what happens. Not because they are weak, because the pattern is old, fast, and deeply grooved. The second is witnessing. The hook shines. You see it, you feel the pull, and you do not bite. This is what Watts called the witness of the storm. Carl Rogers spent his whole career studying what happens when a person is fully seen without judgment. What he found was this. The moment awareness enters a state without trying to fix it or suppress it, the state begins to shift on its own, not because you pushed it, because you stopped pushing against it. Carl Jung would say the same thing differently. The unconscious only keeps its grip when it is unnamed. The moment you bring the light of awareness, not judgment, just awareness, the grip loosens. So witness does not mean passive. It does not mean you approve of what you are feeling or what happened. It means you create a gap, a small one. Even a millimeter is enough. Enough to breathe. Enough to say, I am feeling this. Not, I am this. That difference between feeling something and being something is the whole game. And here is the harder truth underneath it. The tightening is not just a habit of the mind. It is a biological habit. The body learned this response in early life, probably before you had words for any of it. In the first classrooms of fear and disappointment and misunderstanding, the nervous system wrote a program. And that program still runs every time the conditions feel close enough to match. This is what Watts would call unconscious conditioning, not a character flaw, not something to be ashamed of. A learned pattern running on its original code in a life that looks nothing like the environment where it was written. The agreement with pain, the agreement that says this is how the world works, this is what I deserve, this is what safety feels like. That agreement was signed a long time ago, but it can be renegotiated. Not by fighting the tightening, not by gritting your teeth and refusing to feel it, but by watching it. By being the sky instead of the storm. The sky does not argue with clouds. It does not insist the sun should be out. It simply holds whatever weather arises and remains itself. You can do that, not perfectly, not all at once, but one breath at a time. Look closely at certain lives and you start to see something that is both unsettling and liberating. The external circumstances vary wildly, but something underneath stays constant. An orientation. A way of meeting whatever happens. An emotional temperature that shapes the meaning of every event before the mind can comment. Viktor Frankl survived 4 Nazi concentration camps, including Auschwitz. Lost his wife, his parents, his brother, every material thing stripped away. And what he wrote from inside that experience, what became one of the most widely read books of the 20th century, carries a thread that runs all the way through it. Not optimism, something harder than optimism. A capacity to hold an open space between the event and the response. He called it freedom, the last human freedom, to choose your own response regardless of conditions. Between stimulus and response, he wrote, there is a space. In that space lies our freedom. That space is what Watts calls the witness, what Jung calls consciousness of the complex, what neuroscience, with its less poetic but equally accurate language, calls cortical regulation of the amygdala. The space has many names. It is the same space. Now bring it closer to home. Nelson Mandela spent 27 years in prison on Robben Island, a small cell. Forced labor in a lime quarry that permanently damaged his eyesight. When he was released in 1990, reporters expected to find a man consumed by rage. Rage that any reasonable human being would consider completely justified. What they found was different. Mandela had spent those years in a deliberate practice, not enlightenment, a practice. He had decided, and this was a decision made like an athlete trains, repeatedly, daily, that he would not allow hatred to become his resting state, not because hatred was immoral. Because he understood that if hatred became the baseline, he would arrive on the other side of freedom still imprisoned. Imprisoned where no door can reach, he chose a different architecture. That is not a story about sainthood. That is a story about emotional engineering. Now bring it all the way down to the everyday. Consider someone like Daniel, a 34-year-old product manager in San Francisco. By every external measure, Daniel had done the work. 6-figure salary, a well-decorated apartment in the Mission, a promotion before 30, a stable relationship. The whole checklist checked. And yet there was this persistent low hum, a sense that the next milestone, the next raise, the next title, the next thing, was where things would finally click. What Daniel had not yet seen was this. He had built an entire life as fuel for an emotional state that existed before any of those achievements. The baseline of urgency, of inadequacy, of the floor might give way at any moment. That state was not a product of his life. His life was a product of that state. He was not using his work to succeed. He was using his success to feed the familiar feeling that it was never enough. Identity is fluid. When Daniel started to see this, not through a dramatic breakdown, but through a series of quiet, honest conversations with a therapist who asked the right questions, the first feeling was disorientation. If the urgency is not mine, if the inadequacy is not mine, if the emotional resting state that organized my whole adult life is not who I am, then who am I? That disorientation is the signal. Something real is happening. Identity is fluid not because you have no substance, but because the real substance of who you are is vastly larger than the emotional states you learn to inhabit. Those states are like clothes. You have worn them so long you forgot they could come off. Martin Seligman spent decades studying what he called learned helplessness. Animals, and then humans, placed in situations where pain was unavoidable eventually stopped trying to escape, even when the exit was right in front of them. They had learned, at the level of the nervous system, that the pain was the permanent condition. The baseline had been reconfigured. Seligman spent the second half of his career studying how to reconfigure it back. What he found was consistent. The reconfiguration does not begin with changing the external circumstances. It begins with changing the internal narrative, the interpretation. The story the system is telling about what is happening and what it means. Frankl said it from a death camp. Seligman said it from a laboratory. The mechanism is the same. Consider Sarah, a woman who spent 40 years in a quiet, steady state of resentment. Not explosive anger, the kind that corrodes slowly, the kind that ends conversations with never mind when it mattered very much. One afternoon she noticed something. She was not angry at her husband. She had been angry at a version of her father that she had been projecting onto her husband for 2 decades. When that landed, not as a thought, as a felt sense, like a hand opening after years of being clenched, something released. Not all of the anger, not at once, but the agreement with the anger began to be questioned. Agreement with pain, questioned. This does not need a 10-day retreat. It does not need a breakdown that stops everything. It begins with 1 second of pause where there used to be only automatic reaction. One breath where there used to be only contraction. Sometimes that 1 second is everything. If you recognize your own pattern of tightening in these stories, comment fluid below. Naming your state is the first step to letting it pass like wind through trees. Your body is the unconscious mind, not a metaphor, a description. Every time you move through an intense emotional state, fear, rage, shame, excitement, the body releases a specific chemical cascade, hormones, neurotransmitters, peptides. When that cascade repeats often enough, the body builds more receptors for those molecules, literally more doors for that specific chemistry to enter. The body develops a craving, not metaphorically, chemically. Joe Dispenza puts it plainly. When the emotional state you have lived in 4 years begins to change, the body reacts the way a body reacts to withdrawal, because it is. The biological system is experiencing the absence of chemistry that had become its normal, and it will do everything in its power to pull you back toward the familiar. This is why good intentions are not enough. You can want to change with everything you have, and the body will find a reason to recreate the old state, a conversation that triggers the old pattern, a situation that looks just close enough to something from before. The nervous system is not being difficult, it is being precise. It is doing exactly what it was designed to do, maintain the known. Jordan Peterson says this clearly. The cost of changing the baseline is not just biological. It is ontological. You are not just changing what you feel, you are changing what you are. And the nervous system treats a shift in identity with the same alarm it treats a physical threat, because to the system, it is one. The self that is organized around a particular emotional temperature does not dissolve gracefully. It resists. It generates reasons. It produces thoughts that seem logical and urgent and completely reasonable, all of which point toward staying exactly where you are. Watts would laugh at this, warmly, but genuinely. The self so busy protecting itself, that self is itself a construction, a character, the process of thought invented to maintain continuity of the story, not unreal, but not all that you are. You are vastly more than the character that learned to be anxious, or guarded, or chronically not quite enough. The neural mechanism works like this. Each thought produces an emotional state. Each emotional state reinforces the neural circuits that produced the thought. Repeated over years, the pattern carves its own channel. Like a river that has cut its own bed, the water no longer considers another path. Not because another path does not exist, because this path is the only one the system has ever called home. Neuroplasticity means the channel can be redirected. But the redirection does not happen by thinking about change. It happens by feeling the new state before the evidence arrives, by entering a different emotional frequency, deliberately, repeatedly, and holding it long enough for the biology to start adapting to the new chemistry. You have to feel the future before you live it, not as escapism, as neurological practice. Peterson again, this requires discipline, not the discipline of punishing yourself for falling back into the old state. The discipline of choosing, again and again, to return to the new one. The discipline of the athlete, not the judge. Watts would add only this: discipline as dance, not as war. Because the unconscious conditioning is not your enemy. It is simply the past operating in the present. Because nothing has offered the nervous system a compelling enough alternative. And a compelling alternative, in the language of the nervous system, is not an argument. It is an experience repeated, embodied, felt in the body as real. You do not convince the body with words. You convince the body with states. Everything we have explored today comes down to one observation. You were taught by culture, by experience, by 1,000 subtle lessons, that your emotional state is a response to what happens to you, that the world creates what you feel. The discovery that changes everything is simpler and stranger than that. In large part, it runs the other way. The emotional state you carry filters what you see, shapes what you attract, determines what you register as significant and what you pass right by. This is not about blame. The baseline was not your choice. It was built from material you did not select, in conditions you did not design, before you had the awareness to question any of it. But you have that awareness now, and that changes everything. Because here is the thing about trying to change your baseline. The way most people do it, the way the self-help industry sells it, makes it worse. Another optimization project. Another way you are not yet good enough. Another item on the list of things that need fixing before you can finally rest. That approach feeds the very baseline it is trying to change. The real shift begins somewhere quieter. It begins with watching, not fixing. Not improving, watching. Without agenda, without judgment, without the urgency to turn what you see into something better. Just the simple capacity to notice. The tightening is here. The old state arrived. The hook is shining in the water. And then, not biting. The witness of the storm. Carl Rogers spent his career watching what happens when a person is seen without condition. His finding was consistent. Unconditional acceptance is not passive. It is the most fertile ground for genuine change that exists. Nothing transforms inside a climate of rejection. Not even when the rejection is your own mind's voice talking about yourself. The practice, then, is this. Whenever a strong emotion arises, anger, fear, the familiar tightening, the low hum of not enough, do not fight it. Do not suppress it. Do not immediately analyze it into language. Feel it in the body first. Find it physically, chest, stomach, throat, shoulders. Let it be exactly as large as it is. And then, quietly, say this. I am the witness of the storm, not the storm. This is the wind observer practice. It will not dissolve the emotion on the first try, or the second. But what begins to happen, with practice, without forcing it, is that the gap appears. A millimeter of space between you and the state, then 2 millimeters, then enough to breathe, then enough to choose. No fixed number of days, no target repetitions, just the standing invitation. When the hook shines, remember you are the ocean, not the hook. Watts would close with something that sounds light and carries everything. The closer the relationship, the greater the expectations. You believe the people you love most should understand you perfectly, support you without fail, never disappoint. And when they do, when of course they do, because they are human and flawed and free, exactly as you are, the tightening comes harder, because you had given it permission to go deeper. The most radical thing you can do in a close relationship is the same thing that works everywhere else. Stop taking yourself so seriously, not as advice to be careless, as an invitation to see that the character you have been so urgently protecting, with its wounds and its baselines and its expectations and its long history of disappointments, that character is real, but it is not all you are. You are the space that holds the character, the sky that holds the weather, the witness. And when that lands, even for a second, even as a passing taste rather than a permanent address, something releases, a strange lightness. A laughter that comes from below the thoughts. That is the real identity breathing. Share this with someone who takes life, and themselves, too seriously, not as a lesson, as a gift. The next step in this series opens the portal to real identity. We are going in. I am the quantum architect. And you did not end up here by accident.